Hello, I'm Dr. Brian McDonough. Your time is valuable. I'm going to try to keep this to about 3 minutes. Cut out if you don't find it interesting, but it's what I call the story of COVID. Here's the deal. I was an English major from a family where no one was a doctor. And in fact, my father was in sales. So I tell stories and try to communicate information, frankly, as I would understand it as a non-clinician, which is how I grew up. And I've kind of stayed that way. So when I look at COVID, I don't look at it maybe, let's say, like Dr. Tony Fauci or someone else with a very scientific explanation. I just try to explain it the way it is. And sometimes that works. And I think we need it for COVID. Here's the deal. When Ebola hit, it was scary as heck, but you notice it didn't really gain hold. Well, the reason why it didn't gain hold was people died almost instantly with Ebola. It was devastating. And as a result, the virus essentially was there, but it died out because it killed everybody who got it. Other viruses you get, they flutter around and they stay forever because they give you annoying symptoms, but nobody really worries about them because, frankly, they give you annoying symptoms and we don't like being annoyed, but we move on. The problem with COVID, and we saw it right away, was that it was one of those flittering around viruses, but it killed like 1 to 2% of people. That's devastating when you think that you're talking in the United States, potentially 3.3 to 6.6 million people could die. So when people said, oh, it's no worse than the flu, I said, wait a minute, look at the world. Those numbers are higher, which leads me to the flu. We've been dealing with the flu forever. We have a vaccine for the flu. You may not know this, but every year maybe 50 to 55% of people get that vaccine. That's not really that high, 50 to 55%. And we lose about 36,000 to 80,000 people a year, most of them unvaccinated. And every life is important, but we seem to have accepted that as just kind of the way it is. Problem with COVID was when you're talking about a potential 3.3 to 6.6 million, that's far more than the way it is. And sadly, with over 800,000, it is far more than the way it is. 10 times more than the flu. So where are we now? You know the whole story. I'm not going to tell you why it's important to get vaccinated. I'm not going to tell you why it's important to take medications if you get it. I'm not going to go into any of that stuff. We have 200 reports talking about that. But I want to explain this. What has happened with Omicron is it's come in and it has taken over for Delta. And it is clear to us that Omicron is not as aggressive as Delta. It's still nasty and it's still a problem, but not nearly as aggressive. In other words, it has weakened. And if that continues, we may get to the point theoretically where we get to a flu-like status where every year we're getting vaccines for COVID, but the numbers of deaths are significantly less than what we're seeing. We can't count on that, but it's something I really hope for, and I've learned not to predict anything, but I do believe this may be the case. I really think this is where we're headed. But what about right now? What are we learning? Because I know that's what everybody's worried about. Most of our information is from South Africa. We're also getting it now from New York. And what we're learning, for instance, in New York is if you're fully vaccinated with a booster, you are 6 times less likely to get COVID with a similar exposure. You also only keep it in your oropharynx, nasopharynx for like a day or so. It doesn't spread as long. If you're fully vaccinated with a booster, you are 14 times less likely to be hospitalized. So if you're fully vaccinated with a booster, you might get sick, and you could get sick enough that you don't feel well at all, but it's highly unlikely you will die as a result of COVID taking over your system and doing what it's done to so many people. If you are unvaccinated, all bets are off, of course, and you are making up the bulk of the admissions in hospitals right now, and you are making it the bulk of who's really sick, and clearly for the last year, you've made up the bulk of the 470,000 deaths we've seen since a year ago because you don't have any protection. But there is hope for you, and that is that it seems to be even less aggressive for you. Think about it. We're getting 1 million cases a day in the United States, and that's conservative because we don't have tests. So the tests are telling us we have this many. It's probably 1 million. 1 million cases a day. We are having our emergency rooms full of people. Our hospitals are flooding over. But guess what? They're flooding over with people who have COVID associated with some other problem. And many of the people who come to the hospital with COVID for tests are being sent home. The ICU numbers are not anything like you would expect they had been with Delta. If we got 1 million Delta cases a day, do you know what the ICUs would be like? We would have no ventilators. So the reality is we're doing better. And the hope is this. I'm a realist. I will go to my deathbed telling people to get vaccinated. I will also go to my deathbed failing, because there are going to be people who won't do it. They are going to have to learn to accept that they have a greater chance of dying, and they probably have already for whatever reason. Just like someone who smokes 2 packs of cigarettes a day, rides a motorcycle without a helmet, does any number of things, accepts that risk. But the key is this. If the virus is not really killing people who are vaccinated, and people who are vaccinated continue to get it, they no longer essentially are victims of those who chose not to play ball and help out their fellow man. That's it. So you can live with that because people are making their choice and they're not hurting others. Are they costing us money? Yeah, the healthcare system's burden. Are they going to raise our taxes? Yeah. I mean, that's what happens because we eat too much and we drink too much and we smoke too much. All of those things impact us. But the reality is we could get this more like the flu. And once again, let me state, I will never be happy with one death, especially one unnecessary death. But the reality is there's things we can't control. And the more we try to control it, we're going to suffer from anxiety, frustration, and have health effects beyond COVID.